Imagine this. $3.5 billion in compensation is set to be paid out to 2,300 white commercial farmers whose land was forcibly seized nearly 2 decades ago. This is happening in a country where its own citizens live in poverty, without basic amenities such as good roads, electricity, and health care. Andrew B. Vumbe, head of debt management in the Ministry of Finance, revealed that these payments will be made through 10-year Treasury bills. He said, "We now have to go through the process of vetting them and confirming the amounts that they are owed." But here's a burning question. Should a nation still grappling with economic challenges prioritize compensating former colonial landowners over addressing its broader economic disparities?
This idea that some people came from Europe and took people's farm and then they are to be compensated. If a thief comes into your house and removes you out of your house and then furnishes your house and then you remove him, how do you compensate the thief? This is exactly what we are being told. But I know Zimbabwe is being persuaded by the Western world that if you don't compensate our cousins, we are going to ensure that you suffer under sanction. You imagine what would happen if the Zimbabweans started compensating their farmers. They would be sending a wrong message to the white farmers in South Africa. They would be sending a wrong message to the white farmers in Namibia, because the situation is so clear. I mean, you came into Africa, you own 80% of the land. What is independence? Land is the last colonial question. And I don't think that anybody should be compensated. In fact, they have compensated themselves. They have worked this land for many years. Whatever compensation that they wanted, they have done so by engaging in commercial agriculture and deriving the profits therefrom. And if you check any of these farmers in Zimbabwe, in Namibia, in South Africa, half of their wealth is not in Zimbabwe or South Africa or Namibia.
Accord signed in 2020, the government of Zimbabwe agreed to compensate 4,000 white farmers, but it has repeatedly missed payment deadlines. How does a compensation deal expected to cost $3.5 billion over 10 years fit into a country struggling with its own economic stability? And why hasn't there been a similar push for reparations to the descendants of those who suffered under colonization and slavery? This issue isn't unique to Zimbabwe. Consider Haiti, which paid a staggering $21 billion in today's money to France after gaining independence in 1804 just to be free. This crippling debt has had long-lasting repercussions on Haiti's economy, hindering its development for centuries. As Ta-Nehisi Coates, a prominent writer and journalist, once said, "To ignore the fact that one of the oldest republics in the world, Haiti was essentially bankrupt from paying reparations to its former oppressors, is to forget a key chapter in the history of global justice." This raises a critical question. If reparations were demanded from a nation that fought for its freedom, why aren't there more robust efforts to compensate those who were enslaved and oppressed, those who suffered under colonization and slavery? To truly understand this issue, let us travel back in time and uncover the historical roots of land ownership in Africa. How did vast tracts of land come to be in the hands of white colonizers? During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, European powers embarked on an aggressive campaign of colonization, famously known as the Scramble for Africa. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 saw European nations carve up the African continent with little to no regard for indigenous cultures and populations.
1885, different colonial powers from across the world gathered here in the German Reich Chancellor's office. That was, at the time, Bismarck's office. Those powers included, but were not limited to, the USA, Great Britain, France, Portugal, and Spain. They discussed who was going to be allowed by the other powers to take different parts of Africa. Now, nobody from Africa was invited to this conference. The people of Africa had no say over what was going to happen. And the end result, of course, is that the European powers divided Africa. But technically speaking, the agreement that was made was each country would have sole rights to try and grab different parts of the continent. That is to say, if Germany were to try and grab this part of Africa, Britain, Spain, Portugal, they wouldn't contest.
What were the lasting impacts of this arbitrary division of lands on the native populations? The lasting impacts cannot be far-fetched to what is happening in Zimbabwe today. Wait. Do you remember also in South Africa, the 1913 Natives Land Act was a pivotal moment that deprived Black South Africans of their land, engineering widespread poverty. Despite post-1994 land reforms, less than 10% of commercial farmland has been restored to Black South Africans. The South African government continues to push for land redistribution, aiming to correct past injustices and promote economic development. Between 1994 and 2018, South Africa delivered 8.4 million hectares of land to previously disadvantaged individuals. Yet the hunger for land among the rural poor remains unaddressed. In Zimbabwe, then known as Southern Rhodesia, British colonists, led by figures like Cecil Rhodes, established control over the land. Indigenous populations were often forcibly removed, their ancestral lands redistributed to white settlers who developed them into commercial farms. These farms thrived not just because of the land itself, but also due to the exploitation of native African labor under harsh and inhumane conditions. This brings us to another critical question. Should the descendants of these colonizers receive compensation while those whose ancestors were exploited continue to wait for justice? African people are known for their resilience and generosity, but the historical injustices they have endured are vast and often unacknowledged. How do we reconcile the kindness and forgiveness of African people with the need for justice and reparations for past wrongs? Should European countries adopt a forward-looking approach and cease lamenting events from centuries ago, acknowledging the ongoing impact of these historical injustices? The former white farmers set to receive compensation are descendants of colonizers who benefited from generational wealth accrued through exploitation. Why should the Zimbabwean government prioritize compensating them instead of leveling the playing field for all Zimbabweans? While many of these farmers may not be personally responsible, they have undeniably benefited from a system that once oppressed native Zimbabweans. Should we say allowing these former farmers back to work on the land could stimulate the economy and aid Zimbabwe's development? But how can this be managed to ensure it benefits all Zimbabweans fairly? Many of these farmers are already leasing land and conducting operations across the country. Meanwhile, Zimbabwe now boasts master African farmers who are excelling in agriculture, proving that land reform has empowered over 100,000 native Zimbabweans compared to the 40,300 colonial farmers before the reform. Land reform cannot be reversed. It represents the hard-won reality of the liberation struggle. So what does this all mean for Zimbabwe today? What steps can be taken to create opportunities for collaboration between former white farmers and native Zimbabweans to stimulate economic growth and ensure sustainable development? While this pressing issue is yet to have headway, I will ask, how do we address the irony that the same African governments are now selling vast tracts of land to foreign investors while their own citizens live in abject poverty without basic amenities?
Activists are sharing their concerns over the new deal that has been happening all over Africa, mainly in Zimbabwe, Kenya, Liberia, Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. And this deal is between a Dubai company and African government. The countries that I mentioned, they are selling land. For example, Zimbabwe has sold 20% of their land to this company. Liberia has sold 10%, but the Liberia one is still on hold. They're still debating it, and even though the deal happened in March 2023 last year, President Way is not in that position anymore. As you know, there was an election.
Is it that after a while, or probably after a change in government in all these African countries, they will want to take their land back, leading to another cycle of whopping compensations after the foreigners have exploited all the resources? Why is there a recurring pattern of external dependency when local empowerment and self-sufficiency should be the ultimate goal? But viewers, Should the land be returned, or should there be a fair and equitable system where those returning must pay for the land and compensate the Africans who toiled under their ancestors' watch? Instead of focusing on compensation, perhaps the emphasis should be on building an equitable future. What steps can be taken to create opportunities for collaboration between former white farmers and native Zimbabweans to stimulate economic growth and ensure sustainable development? Justice and dignity demand that these issues be addressed on an international stage. Former slaves and colonized peoples have never been compensated for their forced labor and suffering. This historical debt remains unpaid, hindering development and perpetuating inequality. How can the global community work towards genuine reconciliation and reparations? As Nelson Mandela once said, overcoming poverty is not a task of charity, it is an act of justice. Should Zimbabwe prioritize compensation for former colonial farmers, or should it focus on building an equitable future that benefits all its citizens? Is it time for a new approach to addressing historical injustices, one that promotes collaboration and mutual growth? Or does it mean African leaders are head cause of this for their personal gain? Comment below, share your insights, and let's get this conversation rolling.
If you are still not following us, you are probably never going to see us again. But if you are, congrats. You are on a journey of discovery as we unlock the mysteries of the past.